Hello everyone. Today I have David Hearst, who is the editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, which exclusively focuses on the Middle East affairs here with us in Istanbul. We will be discussing the post-Brexit policy towards the Middle East. What has changed since the Brexit in the British policy towards the Middle East, and if anything. So David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So when you look at the post-Brexit, do you see any change in the British engagement with the Middle East in terms of priorities?
Okay. Firstly, you cannot talk about post-Brexit. Brexit hasn't happened, and Brexit is a much longer, more painful process than even the Brexiteers, the Leavers, imagined. It's a very anguished process. It is an all-consuming process. It doesn't give you the energy to think about anything else. And at the point of time of speaking, we don't have a hard Brexit strategy, and we appear not to have either a proper support for a checkers deal, either within Brussels or within Parliament. It's impossible to talk about post-Brexit. What we can talk about is the ferment and the turmoil involved in a period, certainly which will go right the way up to the European Conference in November, if that ever happens, or indeed the actual leaving date, which will be next year. The possibility of a lorry park being created in the whole of Kent as a result of borders where real checks have had to happen and us running out of basic things like pharmaceuticals and drugs is still a very real one. So don't underestimate the turmoil. The second point I'd like to make as a result of that is that everything else, the Middle East, Turkey, becomes second or third to that. If Brexit were to go swimmingly, which I don't think it will, you could envisage a relationship in which Britain is more important. It's more important for Britain to have transactional relationships with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf states, and it would be more dependent on these contracts and more dependent on what I would call the sort of reverse of the colonial relationship, where someone who has a lot of money to spend, like Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, can turn up in London and treat and accept Theresa May at his tradesman's entrance, if you like. That's putting it slightly provocatively, but the relationship would have certainly have changed. He is the money and we're the beggars. I think other than Syria and the possibility of a whole new wave of refugees heading towards Europe, Europe and Britain in particular is exhausted by the Middle East after all the mistakes it has made there, particularly the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it simply doesn't have the energy to formulate either a cogent policy or even to adopt its role traditionally as being a mediator.
Let's go for more specific topics. Syria, Idlib has been in discussion for quite some time. What are where does Britain stand? How much Britain is willing to invest in discussion, or how real a British policy towards Syria? Do we have one?
I don't think we do. I think it's retrenchment. I think there are specific interests, like the number of British nationals being held in Turkey, that Britain doesn't want Turkey to release, by the way, who were involved.
From radical groups?
From radical groups. Even people who weren't involved in radical groups but are around them. There's absolutely no wish for them, and so there's a certain amount of leverage there as well. Specifically on Syria, I think there's been a retreat, and they are leaving it up to Turkey and Russia.
And how about let's go a bit to Iran file, because the nuclear file has been one of the success story of the EU foreign policy in a sense, and Britain was one of the key architects along France and Germany. And Trump did what it promised to do, And at this stage, do you see what Britain can do or will do?
I think on Iran, Britain would genuinely like to see the treaty in being, because it regards it as a good thing. It would allow for the most intrusive nuclear inspections. I think that view is absolutely genuine. However, a realpolitik is that if America is in charge of the banking system, Britain, for instance, could not force British Airways to keep flying to Iran. And it's the power of money, and it's the power of the banking system. And so you've had major pullouts of contracts of Western oil companies and car companies, particularly German ones and French ones, that just simply shrug their shoulders and say, we'd love to be here, but we can't do it if we have to be traded in America. And it's the power of the American market for European companies. So in a sense, these contracts are more important than something called British foreign policy. British foreign policy is dwarfed by the realpolitik of major companies pulling out of Iran because otherwise they would be shut out of the American market. Now, were there to be a change of presidency in America, then I think there would be a huge push to reinstate at least this particular piece in the jigsaw puzzle for no other reason than wanting to re-establish some form of stability in the region. And I think we would rebalance the Western foreign policy to the Middle East, not purely on what Riyadh or Abu Dhabi want, but what Doha, Amman, Ankara, Beirut and other regional capitals want as well. I think it would be, and Kuwait, for instance, or Oman. I think you could see a rebalancing of the policy post-Trump. But with Trump there, I think there's a collective shrug of the shoulders and an expression of weakness.
And the last one on the Gulf. This is like a place where Britain has historical ties and historical influence as well too. So when it comes to Gulf affairs, what are the priorities of the Britain? And secondly, given the nature of the Gulf crisis, is Britain willing to play any role in the Gulf crisis?
Well, one of the post-Brexit dreams was that, isn't this marvellous, Britain would have trade contacts with the GCC. What happened to the GCC? A failed coup happened in Qatar, followed by a blockade. So that was one of the idiocies, for instance, of Brexit. As you can see, I'm no supporter of Brexit. But it was this sort of romantic view that somehow Britain could return to a gloriously independent island trader hovering somewhere in the mid-Atlantic and make independent deals with newly emerging markets, which is one reason why it is so keen to keep on selling arms to Turkey. However, that is shattered by a world in which regional organisations like the GCC are even more fragile than Britain's relationship with Europe was. There's a huge mistake. So now Britain's policy is not to annoy the Saudis too much and to keep on having investments from Qatar. That obviously is not a policy, but it's what Britain is doing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. We had David Hearst, Editor-in-Chief of Middle East Eye, with us.